So I'm so delighted to have Dr. Steve Carver with us today. We talked shortly before, Steve and me, and we worked on the book and the study, The Potential of Wilderness in Switzerland, and we wanted to model wilderness in Switzerland. We always stumbled upon his publications. He modeled wilderness in Europe, in the UK, I think in China, in Iceland.
Mhm.
Yeah, he was a huge inspiration for us. And so I thought, why not invite him on an online call? I'm so happy that it worked out. I think if it would have been a talk in person, it would have been quite more complicated. Um, so I'm so happy to have you here, Steve, today. Steve Carver is a geographer and professor of rewilding and wilderness science at the University of Leeds. And he's also director of the Wildland Research Institute. He has several decades experience in modeling landscapes with a focus on wildlands and wilderness. And as I read on your website, you also like to be in the great outdoors by skiing, mountain biking, hiking, etc. Steve will talk about opportunities for enhanced wilderness protection and rewilding in Europe. I'm eager to know what you have to share with us. I'm convinced we can learn a lot, as you also work a lot with the IUCN. I think you will also um, tell us something about your work there.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, Steve, you have the word. I'm so happy to have you here.
Okay. Thank you, Sebastian. Yes, Professor of Rewilding and Wilderness Science. That's a long story, maybe over a beer at some point if we can manage it. But yeah, I thought it was better than boring old geography when given the option of my title. So yeah, what I'm hopefully going to get across today is this idea that we can build on wilderness quality mapping to meet our targets under the 30 by 30 vision of the Kunming-Montreal Agreement and using some, exploratory spatial modeling. Before I start, I just point out that there's a second name on the presentation there, and that's Yuri Strus, who's my colleague in Kiev, Ukraine. He works for FZS, the Frankfurt Zoological Society. So a lot of the work that I'm presenting here has been done jointly with Yuri, working under some, as you can imagine at the moment, some difficult circumstances. So just as an outline to the talk, I'd like to give you some background before describing the work that we did originally as part of the EU's Wilderness Quality Index 1.0 for the European Environment Agency, and then describe some of the work that I've been doing with Yuri and FZS and extending that work and expanding the coverage to continental Europe, not just the EU member states. But then bring that back to, what does it mean in terms of our joint agreements, our joint commitments to the 30 by 30 targets, which are outlined in the Kunming-Montreal Agreement from COP15, and how GIS and indeed participatory approaches can help better understand that. And there's an issue here, we'll come back to it later, about how we actually disaggregate those targets at different spatial levels when we're talking about, this vague figure of 30%. And there are two principal research questions here. Where, as a geographer, where questions are always very important. Where potential new protected areas to protect biodiversity could be found, but also the potential areas for restoration and rewilding under target two. And then I'll, conclude with some thoughts on further work, and you can ask questions. So in terms of a background as to why it's important, I always say that, if we can't put a line on a map and say where this vague, fuzzy concept of wilderness is, then we are very much on the back foot in terms of protecting it. But the raison d'etre there is that we know that global extinction rates, biodiversity, are about 1,000 times higher than background. We are in the middle of the sixth great extinction. And biodiversity finds its certainly at a regional level anyway. Let's ignore global targets for the minute. Maybe we'll discuss that later in the questions. But at a regional level, it's those areas of high quality wilderness and wild land which provide the greatest opportunity for preserving biodiversity. And indeed, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework listed retaining most of the existing, I'd like to say all, but most of the existing intact wilderness areas as its first target in the 21 action-oriented targets for the 2030 CBD. And this just simply recognizes that wilderness conservation is a top priority for biodiversity. Wilderness areas provide us with complex refugia for species above and beyond the simplified landscapes that we've created in our towns, cities, and agricultural landscapes. And that's just simply underpinned by the Kunming-Montreal Agreement Target 3 to protect 30% of land, sea, and water for high biodiversity. Now, most of what I'm going to talk to here is about land. It incorporates terrestrial aquatic ecosystems as well, but it does ignore the sea. There are other people doing work on that. So in Europe, I know Switzerland is not part of the European Union, but within the wider European setting, there was a European Parliament resolution on wilderness in Europe back in 2008, 2009, which was adopted very strongly in favour, 538 votes in favour, only 19 against. So this massive cross-party endorsement of this idea that wilderness is important. And that's kind of interesting because as Europeans, we've long transported or exported the wilderness idea or ideal to other countries in the world, the New World, the Americas, Australia, etc. But now we're re-importing the idea back and saying, well, actually, we still have our own wilderness areas in Europe and they need to be protected. But that European Parliament resolution gave this kind of 6 points of action. 1, develop a clear definition, so what it is we're talking about. 2, it gave a mandate to the European Environment Agency to go ahead and map those wilderness areas. 3, undertake a study of values and benefits of wilderness. 4, develop a strategy. 5, stimulate the development of new areas through restoration, and we might call that, rewilding to some level. There's a debate about whether the two, to what degree the two are interlinked. And 6, to promote the values of wilderness with the NGOs and local communities. Now, it's interesting enough that Leeds and people from Leeds have been involved in 1, 2, 3, and to some extent 4 of that list. And now through ecological restoration and rewilding to the work of the IUCN. And these were endorsed as key actions in this Postelski, our message. It was a letter that we wrote at that Congress to member states, and that was supported by a bunch of organisations. So in terms of the EU wilderness guidelines, one of the principal things was to come up with a definition. We have this definition of wilderness in Europe as an area governed by natural processes, composed of natural habitats and species, large enough for effective ecological functioning of natural processes, and is unmodified or only slightly modified without any of these intrusive or extractive human activities through settlement, infrastructure, agriculture, visual disturbance. All of these things can be, to some extent or other, can be mapped. And of course, anything that's involving mapping these days, we're naturally talking about either remote sensing and GIS or both. And there's the link to the document at the bottom there. that then led forward into having got a definition. There was a call in point number 2 of that list from the European Parliament resolution to actually develop a register and an index. Um, the register was done by surveying all of the member states and their ENGOs who had access to the data on which protected areas were classified as IUCN category 1A, 1B, or category 2 within national parks. But part of that work was then to develop a wilderness quality index, and this was done in 2013. And the way that we did that was we were interested in potential natural vegetation. So that's the patterns of vegetation that would exist under prevailing edaphic conditions, so topography, soil, climate, without human influence being there. But of course, humans have been on the planet for at least a couple of million years, and last thousands or so years have had a big impact on potential natural vegetation. So we actually looked at the Corrine land cover data and looked at the difference between the current vegetation pattern from the Corrine data and what it would be without human influence, including data on grazing intensity. We also looked at remoteness from settlements and remoteness from mechanized access. And we used a multi-criteria modeling approach. We used keeping the continuous nature of the data. And what we found in there was a very strong pattern of high latitude and high altitude has been a very strong predictor of wildness, as probably we would expect. And this was supported by and underpinned by the Wild Europe Working Definition. So these are the version 1 maps. So on the left, you can see a wilderness continuum. This is the Wilderness Quality Index. And there are artificial surfaces they're on there. Those are the principal urban areas, the water areas in blue. But then this gradation from 0 through to 100% in a simple index based on that difference from potential natural vegetation, remoteness from settlement, remoteness from mechanized access. And of course, if you've got one of these continuum maps, the immediate temptation is to top slice it and say, oh, where is the top 1%? And that's interesting. You see on the right there, we've reclassified that continuum map into top 1%, top 5%, top 10% wildest cells. And I remember a few years ago, before I started the work on Iceland, I got a phone call from a lady called Sif Konradsdottir, as an environmental lawyer in Iceland. And she said, how much wilderness have we got in Iceland? And I said, well, I don't really know to be exact, but give me a few minutes and I'll call you back with the answer. And I looked at this map on the right and did the, simple calculation and found out that Iceland has 43% of those top 1% wildest areas. Which was significant for them, and I've been doing work in Iceland ever since. But the interesting thing is if you actually then start to integrate the data from the Wilderness Register, the countries which were able to return from that survey areas of significant wilderness, protected as wilderness, and compare that to the wildest cells from that previous map. And on the right there, you see areas coloured in green are wilderness areas from the mapping that are protected by Natura 2000 and or the CDDA categories 1A, 1B, etc., versus those which are not protected. And if you look at Iceland and look at the Scandi countries, for example, there are large areas of de facto wilderness which are not under any kind of formal protection. And I think that's partly because these countries have a very large proportion of Europe's wilder areas, and so not everything is protected. It becomes more interesting, as we'll see in a minute, when you look at individual member states as to what is and isn't protected. So yeah, a couple of years ago, we were asked to look at developing a version 2 of that map, but extend it from the EU member states to continental Europe. And this was published last year by Yuri and myself in Land, and there's the DOI for it there. But basically, we updated the WQI1. We extended it to non-EU states, so Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Georgia, Moldova, Russia, west of the Urals, and of course the Ukraine. Yuri did most of the button pushing, as I call it. I was directing operations, and in this instance, and so he opted to use Google Earth Engine with the contemporary data sets which are available through that. If you have any technical Google Earth Engine questions, then I will defer to Yuri for those. I'm an ArcGIS user rather than Google Earth Engine. And what we did then, we were able to compare that to the version 1 and also to the global human influence index, the human footprint index, which comes from WCS. We utilized the Wild Europe working definition criteria, and we're interested in setting this up as a baseline which can be used for future iterations for tracking trends, all done at 30-meter resolution, so high resolution data sets. Just a reminder of what that Wild Europe working definition is. I mean, obviously it dovetails to the EU definition in Natura 2000, but large natural ecosystems, again, managed by natural processes where the primary goal is protection, restoration, and expansion of these non-intervention landscapes. They need to be of sufficient size and scale. So the threshold for such areas is 3,000 hectares. Allowing for natural processes to occur and are considered to be both considered on both their ecological and social values. So size and scale is important, must be large enough. Natural processes, so management is non-intervention principles, allowing for natural processes to dictate not just the state of the ecosystem, but its natural ecological progression through processes of succession and disturbance. Recognizes that the value to humans is through ecological services, such as clean water, erosion control, flood protection, etc., and potentially providing greater resilience to climate change. But there is also a social and spiritual value to be recognized. So these areas hold value for their solitude. And if anybody knows the 1964 Wilderness Act definition, opportunity for solitude in the US is a very strong social and spiritual value associated with wilderness landscapes. But of course, they're subjective, and we'll come back to that in terms of how we might capture that using participatory GIS, possibly in the discussion later. But there's a practical application here, is that the definition is used to guide, or can be used to guide, conservation efforts and identify areas for restoration. Our model, complex, I know, well, actually, it's quite simple. It looks complex, there's a lot going on in there, but basically the top line are the data sets that we use. So livestock densities, the primary forest database, land cover, location of principal rivers. We use nighttime lights, population density, and settlement and residential roads to predict settlement patterns, and then the wider road network to model remoteness from mechanized access. So the intermediate steps are just how we've either reclassified that or modeled that based on things like cost surfaces and distance surfaces to create maps of naturalness, remoteness from population, remoteness from mechanized access. And I think at a regional scale like Europe, then these more simple models are the way to go. But as you drill down and look at smaller and smaller areas in more detail, then that enables us to bring in some of the more complex models based on visual impact and walking times and things like that, which I've done a lot of work on in places like Scotland and and some of the national parks in the USA. So this is version 2 of the Wilderness Quality Index. As you can see, we've expanded eastwards to cover the whole of continental Europe, west of the Ural Mountains. The data on the left there is interesting. Sorry, it's a little bit small, but the top left is the distribution of proportion of high-weighted wilderness land according to latitude. So we see a strong latitudinal gradient. The graph below it is altitude. So again, a very strong altitudinal gradient. I think the drop off in this latitude map here is due to the Alps and the Pyrenees and the Carpathians and other high mountain areas which have high wilderness values. There's a very nice strong correlation with altitude. And then just for fun, we included latitude and longitude in there. Longitude in there for a bit of east-westness, and then distance from oceans as well as just an example. And of course, that's taking the whole data set into account. But if you could imagine transects based on this. So if you were taking a rail journey from Scotland through to London and then across the tunnel to Paris and up to Tromsø in the Nordic countries, then you would see a different kind of pattern. It'd be great looking out the window as you did that. So back to those research questions. Can we identify and evaluate the conservation status of the wildest and most ecologically intact areas across Europe? And indeed, how do we meet the EU and the national commitments under the recent COP15 Kunming-Montreal agreements on these 30 by 30 visions and the relevant CBD targets? And just a reminder that target 3 states that we should ensure and enable by 2030. It's not going to happen, but it's an aspirational target. Let's start doing this, perhaps. There are at least 30% of terrestrial inland water areas and marine and coastal areas, especially those of particular importance for biodiversity and ecosystem functions, are, and I've underlined this, effectively conserved and managed through ecologically represented, well-connected and equitably governed systems of protected areas. And I'm always reminded when I see this term of that representative of Aldo Leopold and his rule. It says the first rule of intelligent tinkering is keep all the parts. And as somebody who tinkers with old British motorcycles, taking them apart and putting them back together again, trying to make them work, I can fully understand that. But in those agreements and in those targets, there's actually very little detail on how these are to be achieved and principally about where. Is 30%, is that a global target? Is it regional target? Are there national targets? What are they? Are we expected to apply that 30% target at all of the different spatial resolutions, or is it just a global target? It's not quite clear. But following on from that, actually target 1 is ensuring that areas are under participatory, integrated and biodiversity inclusive spatial planning. So I think that sort of lays the field open to apply the kind of techniques that we're talking about here to slice and dice, if you like, these continuum, at least wild to most wild, to see which areas might be most fruitful and which areas are better connected than others. So the guidance on target setting, following on from that, we should probably explore current extant protected areas and other areas of effective conservation measures, and actually question how important they are for biodiversity, ecosystem function and services, and how well connected they are. But let's look at important areas for biodiversity which are not currently protected. So at this point, we make that distinction between de jure and de facto. And when we say de facto, we mean those areas which have all of the qualities of wildness. They're remote, they're large areas, they're ecologically intact. There's very little human influence or intrusion within them, but perhaps are not necessarily protected. Whereas de jure refers to those landscapes which are under some kind of legal protection. Um, So, and I think, working from those targets, developing coordinated, effective, protected area networks and conservation measures across the whole of Europe would be a way to go and look at how those are to be implemented at a national level. And this provides us with some opportunities for expansion by eco-region, which I'll show in a minute. So back to Wilderness Quality Index version 2.0. If we take the whole of that study area, the whole of continental Europe, which is everywhere to the west of the Urals, and do the same top slice, top 5%, top 10%, top 20% wildest cells, and I suppose we could go to 30% as well, then the pattern looks something like that. It's very much biased by, again, high altitude, high latitude areas. So we're missing something in Central Europe and lowland Europe, in that, back to Leopold's mantra of first rule of intelligent tinkering is keep all of the parts. So that's option one. There's the top 30%, included 30% in this target. And okay, there are a few small patches in some of the areas of Central Europe, but it is very much dominated by northern latitudes and high altitudes. Option two would be to say, and I think this is my favorite option, is actually let's target the top 30% of continental Europe within biogeographic regions rather than take a whole Europe approach. And so we then get into having separate distributions for each of those bioregions. And so I just took these from the European Environment Agency. So Alpine, Anatolian, Arctic, Atlantic, etc. So there's identifying the top 30% from that distribution that are within each of these regions. I think that is a better pattern because we're capturing a richer picture of ecosystems. Some of these areas in Central Europe might not necessarily be, and definitely aren't, as wild and as large as some of these remote areas in the far north, but locally they're important representative samples of the ecosystems present. The third option, I suppose, and this is a pragmatic way of thinking, is that okay, Europe has certain levels of decision making as a economic region, the Berne Convention, etc., for applying to European member states, signatories rather. But pragmatically, these kinds of decisions are taken at a national level, taking the lead from international treaties, etc., and like the Kunming-Montreal Agreement. So I think it's also sensible to think, well, where are the top 30% wildest areas within countries? And of course, this starts to cover Europe with a lot more target areas. If you compare it to that or even that, then we're actually increasing the total area which falls within the 30% effectively by drilling down and looking at individual countries. So I think that's as a political solution, I think that's a map which might be of interest to each member state, whereas the top 30% in each member state. But I think that needs to be pretty much taken in to account with this map as well. This is just a simple plot just showing the distribution. So we've got Wilderness Quality Index on the vertical axis, and then we got its representation as a series of box plots within the different IUCN categories in the World Database on Protected Areas. So category 1A is strictly protected, category 1B wilderness, and that's kind of neat to see that the model seems to be capturing distribution of high wilderness quality very nicely. Yeah, there are a few little outliers in that, but if we look at the mean and the interquartile range within that distribution, it is very much up towards the top end in the wilderness category of the IUCN Protected Areas database. Now, national parks, natural monuments, nature reserves, and cultural landscapes, protected landscapes. Now, an interesting aside there is that all of our national parks in the UK, and the UK, remember, was unable to return any wilderness areas in that 2013 wilderness register. All of our national parks are Category 5 areas. Then you've got your Category 6 sustainable use. And then we've also included Natura 2000, the Emerald Network, and then these other effective areas of effective conservation measures. I know this is a busy table, but just to illustrate that we have broken that down, so with biogeographical zones, and then broken it down, showing the percentage within each of those categories, including the Natura 2000, Emerald, and other in there, and then also broken it down in terms of overlap with those protected areas and those which are not protected. And I think that not protected is an interesting column, actually, that shows just how big a problem it is when you start to break it down by these biogeographical zones. So just to conclude, I've been talking for just over half an hour, and I know we need to leave time for questions. But I think the Kunming-Montreal Agreement gives us targets to aim for with these 30 by 30 visions, and the target 2 of 30% of land, sea, and water protected for biodiversity and landscape, and target 3 protecting, or rather restoring, 30% of degraded land, sea, and water areas by 2030. And I think that's where the rewilding comes in. Those of us in the IUCN rewilding thematic group, we quite often say that all rewilding is restoration, but not all restoration is rewilding. I think, and there's a difference here between the two terms. I don't know if you're familiar with the paper by Hayward et al. From 2019 that just said, rewilding is just restoration in new clothes. But we would say that rewilding is very different from restoration when carried out effectively. We often say that restoration is human-led but nature-enabled. So in other words, it's us as humans dictating which nature-based solutions we're going to apply to achieve a particular end objective, whether that's river restoration or land remediation or coastal realignment. Whereas rewilding is very, very different. It flips that approach on its head and says that rewilding is nature-led, human-enabled. So it's nature calling the shots in terms of determining its own ecological trajectory, and it's just us as humans having the humility and the foresight to step back and allow that to happen. But anyway, I digress. So we know that Europe is a very diverse continent. It's got a range of landscapes and levels of development. And that development, much of developed Europe has been in those biomes which could, afford humans a living. We've been able to turn them over to agriculture or forestry or fisheries, some kind of extractive land use to exploit that human appropriation, net primary productivity for our own benefit. And as you go further north or higher altitudes, those landscapes of affordability are diminished. It's harder and harder to farm. It's not as easy to travel or settle in some of those areas. So it is a rich continent with a diversity of landscapes, which is reflected in those patterns. But if we're to apply those 30 by 30 targets, it requires us to, try different spatial disaggregations of those targets across. And I think it's important to do it through the biogeographical regions initially, but then further break that down at a national level. So the European-wide patterns are skewed by high latitude, high altitude countries and regions and topography. the national targets obviously vary by size and geography. It's very easy to see how the Nordic countries, Iceland, Switzerland, Sweden, sorry guys, Finland and Norway can meet their commitments under the Kunming-Montreal Agreement because they're probably there already, if not more. Whereas the lowland countries like the Benelux countries, it's difficult to see how that might be achieved. Um, there are some cross-sectoral and interregional collaboration opportunities, particularly in terms of transboundary cooperation. If you don't mind, I'll just flip back to one of those maps because I forgot to point that out. I mean, yeah, look at this. I mean, okay, this is Russia, but look at the sharp boundary between the former Russian, former USSR. There's a very sharp boundary caused by edge effects when you start disaggregating by nation, and even in Switzerland and again different patterns. Your 30% is very much your mountains, and your lower altitude areas are not falling within that distribution. So go back to my conclusion slide. There's some interesting species habitat, species area relationships to unpick here. And obviously, particularly when we start looking at a country by country top 30%, there are going to be conflicts with existing land use, which need to be considered. But I think it may well highlight opportunities for sustainable land management, and not only that, but connectivity approaches. I should have probably put some slides in here I was just conscious of the amount of slides I had for the work that we did in France with Adrien Guet from the University of Nantes and my friend and colleague Jonathan Carruthers-Jones, where we were looking at mapping haute naturalité, or high naturalness in France. And one of the key layers that we included there was ecological connectivity. It's easy to see how that might on the basis of further analysis. I think financing mechanisms is an interesting point for discussion, either through natural capital assessment or green financing, although I am rather suspicious of some of the aims of that, in that, I think for example, if you're getting into rewilding to create money, then I think you're doing it for the wrong reasons. I think, pragmatically speaking, I know that money makes the world go around, but I think, we need to get the financial mechanisms right for this kind of thing. And it may be based on taxation, it may be based on payment for ecosystem service models, but I think I do have some concerns about green financing. Might be a point for discussion. The new EU nature restoration law and the targets to restore at least 20% of land and sea by 2030 play into this. So, we could look at some of those earlier maps. But I think that's me. I've had 40 minutes. So, as I said, just remind you that Yuri did a lot of button pushing here under some really tricky circumstances. I know I was only able to Skype, Zoom, call him. Skype, we don't use that anymore. Zoom and Teams after 3 p.m, because that's when he could get electricity. So yeah, thanks very much, and open to questions.